What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, most of the food sitting in your refrigerator has a shorter shelf life than the device keeping it cold? That the average American household throws away nearly a third of the food it buys, not because the food went bad on its own, but because we completely lost the knowledge of how to keep it alive longer. For most of human history, wasting food wasn't just wasteful, it was dangerous. It could mean the difference between a family that made it through winter and one that didn't. And the people who survived, the ones who fed their children through blizzards and droughts and supply collapses that make our worst days look comfortable, they didn't have a freezer. They didn't have a Costco. They had something that took generations to build and less than a century to almost completely destroy. They had knowledge. Today I'm bringing that knowledge back. 20 forgotten preservation techniques that kept entire civilizations fed, that your great-grandparents used without thinking twice, and that you can start using in your own home starting today. And I want to be clear about something before we get into this. These aren't novelty tricks. These aren't homesteading hobbies for people with too much free time. These are survival-grade, field-tested methods that work for thousands of years across every climate on Earth. They work just as well today as they did then, because the biology of food spoilage hasn't changed. Bacteria still need moisture. Mold still needs oxygen. Enzymes still need warmth. Change those conditions, and you change everything. Stick around because number 17 on this list kept eggs perfectly edible for over a year, using nothing but water and a mineral you can order online for a few dollars. And number 20 is so ancient, so elegantly effective, that it predates written language entirely, and it is still being used today by people who understand something most of us have forgotten. Make sure you subscribe to Recreational Roots because we post new content every single week about reclaiming the ancestral food knowledge that was quietly taken from us. Let's get into it. Number 1. Salt curing. The oldest pantry on Earth. Before refrigerators existed. Before canning jars. Before any of the modern infrastructure we've built our food supply around. There was salt. And salt wasn't just a seasoning in the ancient world. It was currency. It was power. It was survival distilled into a crystal. Roman soldiers were literally paid in salt. The English word salary comes from a Latin word for salt. Think about that for a moment. The thing you shake onto your eggs without thinking twice was once so valuable that people work for it the way we work for money today. That value existed for one reason. Salt preserved food, and preserved food meant that civilizations could function, armies could march, ships could cross oceans, and families could survive winters that last a half a year. Salt curing works through a process called osmosis. When you pack meat or fish in a heavy layer of salt, the salt draws moisture out of the food's cellular structure. Bacteria are living organisms that require moisture to survive and reproduce. Remove that moisture aggressively enough, and you remove the bacteria's ability to do anything harmful to your food. No moisture means no microbial activity. No microbial activity means no rot. It is one of the cleanest, most elegant biochemical interventions ever discovered, and it was discovered independently by cultures on every continent, because the logic is written into the nature of salt itself. Traditional salt-cured hams hung in European farmhouses for 18 months or more, not in refrigerators. In cool rooms, cellars, and barns, simply coated in salt and thyme. Salt cod fed the naval fleets of the age of exploration. Sailors crossing the Atlantic for months at a time ate salt-preserved fish that had been cured weeks before they ever set foot on a ship. The Appalachian tradition of salt-curing pork was so reliable that mountain families could slaughter a hog in November and draw from that preserved meat all the way through the following summer. That's 8 months of shelf-stable protein from a single application of salt and knowledge. The practical method is straightforward. Use non-iodized salt. Kosher salt works perfectly. Curing salt, which contains a small amount of sodium nitrite, works even better for longer-term preservation of meat because the nitrite provides an additional antimicrobial layer specifically against the anaerobic bacteria that salt alone doesn't fully address. Pack your meat generously in a non-reactive container, glass, ceramic, or food-grade plastic, and keep it cold, ideally between 36 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A thick pork shoulder needs roughly 1 day of cure time for every 2 pounds of meat. As the curing progresses, liquid will draw out and pool around the meat. That liquid is called brine, and it becomes part of the preservation system. The salt concentration in that naturally formed brine continues to inhibit bacterial growth even as the meat rests in it. Salt curing got replaced not because it stopped working, but because refrigerators were more convenient and required no skill. And that's the pattern you're going to hear over and over again throughout this video. These techniques didn't fail us. We traded them for convenience, and convenience is wonderful right up until the moment it isn't available. Number 2, air drying, the method that built civilizations. If salt curing is the oldest pantry on Earth, air drying is the oldest kitchen appliance. And unlike every appliance currently plugged into your wall, it requires no electricity, no maintenance, no manufacturer warranty, and it never breaks down. All it needs is time and moving air. That's it. Those two things, accessible to every human being who has ever lived, were enough to preserve food across 6-month Arctic winters, across years-long ocean voyages, across the kind of hardships that would shut down modern supply chains within a week. The principle is the same one underlying almost every preservation technique we're going to discuss today. Microorganisms that cause food to spoil, bacteria, mold, yeast, require moisture to carry out their biological functions. Eliminate moisture slowly and evenly through the circulation of dry air, and you eliminate their ability to establish themselves in your food. What you're left with is food that is shelf-stable, dramatically reduced in weight, and in many cases concentrated to a degree that makes it nutritionally denser per ounce than the original fresh food. Herbs are the most accessible entry point. Tie them in small, loose bundles, because tight bundles trap moisture and can allow mold to form in the center, and hang them upside down in a location with good airflow and low humidity. A covered porch, a dry pantry with a window, a barn in late summer. Within 1 to 2 weeks, you have dried herbs that will hold their potency for a year or more. The flavor difference between properly air-dried herbs from your own garden and the heat-processed commercial dried herbs in a plastic jar from a grocery store is something you have to experience to fully understand. Commercial drying uses high heat to speed the process. High heat destroys volatile aromatic compounds. Air drying is slow, and that slowness is precisely what preserves the most fragile and flavorful parts of the herb. Indigenous cultures across North America hung strips of lean meat to air dry for centuries. This was the original jerky, and it sustained hunters and travelers across distances and durations that no modern energy bar could match. Scandinavian stockfish, whole cod split and hung on wooden racks in the cold Atlantic wind, was the energy source of the Viking Age. It was what made Norse seafaring possible across distances that still impress us today. The Tibetan Plateau, the high Andes, the Mongolian steppe. Every culture living in a dry climate discovered independently that air was a preservation tool, and they built their food security around it. Number 3, sun drying. Free energy, ancient wisdom. Sun drying is air drying with the power turned up. If air drying is a slow, gentle process that works anywhere with enough airflow and low humidity, sun drying is a high-intensity version that uses direct ultraviolet radiation to accomplish in days what air drying takes weeks to achieve. And it's been feeding populations across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Equatorial Asia for thousands of years, using the most abundant and completely free energy source available on this planet. The chemistry is essentially the same as air drying, aggressive moisture removal that denies microorganisms the environment they need to function. But sunlight adds 2 additional mechanisms. First, the radiant heat dramatically accelerates evaporation, compressing a 2-week process into 2 to 5 days, depending on climate, food type, and the intensity of the sun. Second, ultraviolet radiation has genuine antimicrobial properties. UV light damages the DNA and cellular membranes of bacteria on the surface of food, providing an added layer of protection that pure air drying doesn't offer. Sun-dried tomatoes are the most familiar example in modern Western culture, and most people think of them as an artisan food trend. They are not. They are a thousands-year-old preservation technique that Sicilian and Calabrian farm families use to transform the abundance of summer tomato harvests into something that could sustain them through winter. Dried figs, raisins, dried apricots, dried peppers strung in brilliant restraws across the adobe walls of New Mexico and Oaxaca and Andalusia. None of these are culinary fashion. Every single one of them began as a practical answer to the question of how do you keep the harvest from rotting before you can eat it. The traditional method is straightforward. Slice fruits and vegetables evenly, because consistent thickness means consistent drying and prevents some pieces from remaining moist in the center, while others are fully dried. Lay them on clean wooden racks or mesh screens elevated above the ground to allow airflow beneath as well as above. Never lay food directly on soil or bare concrete, because moisture will wick upward and impede drying. Bring the racks inside at night to prevent dew from rehydrating the food and setting back your progress. The food is done when it is leathery, flexible, and has no moist soft spots anywhere in the center. Many traditional cultures applied a light coating of salt before sun drying, combining 2 techniques into a single preservation system that worked faster and more reliably than either technique alone. Number 4, oil submersion. Sealing out the enemy. Oil submersion works on a logic so clean and so obvious once you understand it that you wonder why everyone doesn't still do this. The bacteria responsible for the vast majority of food spoilage are aerobic organisms. They require oxygen to carry out their metabolic functions. No oxygen means no metabolic function. No metabolic function means no spoilage. Submerge food completely in oil, seal out all contact with air, and you create an environment that aerobic bacteria simply cannot inhabit. Provincial and Italian farmhouse traditions packed herbs, roasted peppers, sun-dried tomatoes, and cured meats in olive oil and store them through winter not as a gourmet choice, but as a practical necessity. North African kitchens preserved lemons submerged in oil. Rural Greek households stored olives and cheeses this way for months. Everywhere that oil was available and people needed to preserve food, oil submersion appeared independently. Because the logic is airtight, literally. Herbs are among the best candidates for home oil submersion. Pack dried rosemary, thyme, sage, or basil into a clean glass jar. Cover completely with quality olive oil. Seal the jar and store. Properly dried herbs preserved this way will hold their potency for up to a year. The oil itself becomes infused and is arguably more valuable than the herbs you started with, because you end up with a deeply flavored finishing oil and a supply of preserved herbs in a single preparation. Hard cheeses can be preserved this way as well. Small cubes of firm, aged cheese, fully submerged in olive oil with dried herbs and aromatics, will last weeks at room temperature and months refrigerated. I need to give you a serious safety note here, because this is the one point on this list where a specific and genuinely dangerous mistake is possible. Fresh garlic and fresh herbs in oil at room temperature create conditions favorable to Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium responsible for botulism. Unlike the aerobic bacteria that oil submersion defeats, botulinum is anaerobic. It thrives precisely in low-oxygen environments. This is why any oil submersion preparation containing fresh garlic or fresh herbs must be refrigerated and used within 1 to 2 weeks, or the ingredients must be properly acidified before submersion. Dry your herbs thoroughly before adding them to oil for long-term storage. This is not a technique to improvise with fresh ingredients left on the counter. Our ancestors knew these rules intuitively because they learned them through generations of practice. We need to learn them deliberately. Number 5. Honey preservation, nature's antibacterial seal. Honey is one of the most extraordinary substances nature has ever produced, and its preservation properties are so extreme that they genuinely sound like mythology until you understand the chemistry. Archaeologists excavating ancient Egyptian tombs have found honey that is over 3,000 years old and still edible. Not just technically preserved, actually edible. Nothing the modern food industry produces comes within 1,000 years of that shelf life. Honey achieves this through not one, but 3 simultaneous preservation mechanisms. The first is its moisture content, which sits at around 17% in properly processed raw honey. Bacteria need significantly more ambient moisture than that to function. They essentially dehydrate in the presence of honey, the same way that salt curing dehydrates the food itself. The second mechanism is acidity. Honey has a naturally low pH, typically between 3.2 and 4.5. which is well below the tolerance threshold of most pathogenic bacteria. And the third mechanism is something that sounds almost too elegant to be real. Bees incorporate an enzyme called glucose oxidase into honey during production. That enzyme interacts with the honey and with moisture in the environment to produce small but consistent amounts of hydrogen peroxide, giving honey genuine and ongoing antimicrobial activity. It is essentially self-defending food. Our ancestors used every one of these properties intentionally and creatively. Whole garlic cloves packed into raw honey and left for several weeks become mellow, deeply complex, and shelf-stable. The garlic releases its own moisture and flavor compounds into honey over the first few days, loosening the honey's consistency slightly and creating something that is simultaneously a preserved food and a powerful medicinal preparation. Fruits coated in honey before drying resisted spoilage dramatically better than untreated fruit. Nuts sealed in honey kept through winter across European and Asian food traditions. Honey glaze meats demonstrated measurably longer shelf life than untreated equivalents. This wasn't folk medicine superstition. It was practical applied chemistry developed through generations of careful observation. The honey garlic preparation is one of the most accessible and useful things you can make starting today. Pack raw, unprocessed garlic cloves into a clean jar of raw honey. Seal it loosely for the first week to allow the gases produced by the fermentation process to escape. Watch it transform over the following weeks into something your great-grandmother would have recognized immediately as a kitchen staple. Number 6. Root cellaring. The earth as your refrigerator. A few feet below the surface of the earth, something remarkable happens. The temperature stabilizes. In most temperate climates, the ground maintains consistent temperature of between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, almost regardless of what the weather is doing above ground. In summer, when ambient air temperatures climb into the 90s, the earth below stays cool. In winter, when temperatures drop below freezing, the earth below stays cool. Not warm, not frozen. Consistently, reliably, dependably cool. And cool, slightly humid, and dark is precisely the environment that a remarkable range of vegetables need to survive for months without any processing, any energy input, or any modern technology whatsoever. Root cellaring is not a primitive compromise. It is a sophisticated application of natural thermodynamics that colonial American families, European frontier homesteaders, and traditional farming cultures on every continent relied on as their primary food storage infrastructure for centuries. It kept families fed through winters that lasted half a year in climates where growing anything from November through April was simply impossible. Potatoes store beautifully in root cellar conditions. Carrots, beets, turnips, parsnips, and celeriac all thrive in cool, slightly humid darkness. Cabbage holds for months. Onions and garlic prefer slightly drier conditions with better airflow. Apples and pears can be root cellared successfully, though they should be kept physically separated from vegetables because they emit ethylene gas as they ripen, and that gas accelerates ripening in nearby produce, which is the opposite of what you want in a storage environment. You do not need a full underground cellar to take advantage of these principles. An unheated corner of a basement, an insulated crawl space, or even a buried garbage can with straw insulation layered around it can approximate root cellar conditions closely enough to dramatically extend the storage life of your harvest. The key variables are temperature, which should be consistently cool but never freezing, humidity, which should be high enough to prevent shriveling and moisture loss, but not so high as to encourage rot, and light, which should be eliminated entirely because light triggers sprouting in many root vegetables. Root cellaring disappeared from common practice as electric refrigerators became standard household appliances in the mid-20th century. But a refrigerator uses electricity. It breaks down. It holds a fraction of the volume that a serious homesteader or family food producer needs. A properly managed root cellar costs nothing to operate, never breaks down, and can store enough food to carry a family through months of winter. It is a refrigerator that was always there, built into the earth itself. Now, if you're learning something here today, if this content is changing how you think about food security and what's actually possible outside of the industrial supply chain, do me a favor right now and hit that like button. It helps this video reach the people who need this information. And if you're not yet subscribed to Recreational Roots, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We are building a community of people who choose ancestral knowledge over manufacturer dependency. I would love to have you with us. Let's keep going because we are only just getting to the remarkable ones. Number 7, herb ash coating, the forgotten farmhouse secret. This is the one that most people have never heard of, and it is the one that reliably produces the most surprise reactions when people first encounter it. Wood ash, the fine gray powder left in the firebox after a hardwood fire, was used for centuries across European farmhouse traditions as a preservation coating for eggs, cheese, and other stored foods. And it works through genuinely interesting chemistry that deserves to be understood rather than just practiced blindly. Wood ash is highly alkaline. Its pH approaches 12, which puts it at the far end of the alkaline scale. Most bacteria and molds that cause spoilage are adapted to function within a relatively narrow pH range, and virtually none of them can survive or reproduce in a strongly alkaline environment. When you roll an egg or a round of fresh cheese and clean, fine wood ash until it's completely coated. You're creating an alkaline microenvironment on the surface of that food that actively discourages every form of microbial growth that would otherwise attack it. In Tuscany, this technique was used to preserve fresh eggs for months. Eggs were rolled in ash until completely and evenly coated, then stored in crocks or wooden boxes in cool rooms. The alkaline coating performed two functions simultaneously. It prevented the bloom of the egg, which is a natural protective protein coating on the shell surface, from degrading over time, and it created an inhospitable surface environment for any bacteria attempting to penetrate the shell. When the eggs were needed, they were simply rinsed clean and used normally. The egg inside was fresh, preserved, and entirely unaffected by the coating on the outside. For cheese, ash coating performs a more complex set of functions. It protects the surface against unwanted mold species while simultaneously allowing the cheese to breathe slightly, creating conditions that favor the development of the cheese's own natural rind rather than a forced, uniform surface. Morbier, the celebrated French cheese with its distinctive dark layer running to the center, gets that layer from ash. What began as a preservation technique became a defining characteristic of one of France's most beloved cheeses. This is a pattern you see repeatedly in traditional food culture. The survival technique becomes a culinary tradition. The one critical requirement is that you use clean hardwood ash only, not ash from treated or painted wood, which contains chemical compounds you do not want anywhere near your food. Not coal ash, not ash from composite materials. Clean hardwood ash from a fireplace, a wood stove, or a campfire built with natural hardwood. Number 8. Vinegar pickling. The brine that beat time. Vinegar pickling is the one preservation technique on this list that never fully disappeared from common practice. And the reason it survived when so many others faded is simple. The results are too immediate, too useful, and too obvious to forget entirely. But most people today experience vinegar pickling as a flavor choice rather than what it actually is, which is one of the most reliable antimicrobial interventions ever developed for food preservation. Vinegar is acetic acid in solution, at a concentration of 5% or above, which is a standard for commercial white vinegar and apple cider vinegar. Acetic acid creates an environment so hostile to pathogenic bacteria that they simply cannot maintain themselves within it. Clostridium botulinum, E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, all of them are stopped by proper acidification. The key word there is proper. The vinegar needs to penetrate the food thoroughly. The concentration needs to be maintained, and the processing needs to be done correctly. Traditional farmhouse pickles were nothing like the sweet, soft sandwich slices most people think of today when they hear the word pickle. They were deeply acidic, shelf-stable without refrigeration, packed with complex flavor compounds developed during the curing process, and they were a central component of the winter food supply for families across Northern Europe and early America. Sauerkraut, kimchi, and traditional dill pickles all began as fermented preparations rather than vinegar preparations, and we'll get to lacto-fermentation in a moment because it deserves its own discussion. But vinegar pickling offered speed and simplicity that fermentation couldn't match, a reliable preservation method that could be executed in a single afternoon. The basic formula is equal parts water and 5% vinegar, white or apple cider, with salt added at roughly 1 tablespoon per quart of brine for both flavor and additional preservation benefit. Bring that brine to a boil, pack your prepared vegetables into sterile jars, pour the hot brine over them leaving the appropriate headspace, and process in a boiling water bath for the time specified for your specific food and jar size. Properly processed, sealed vinegar pickles will hold on a pantry shelf for a year or more without refrigeration. Cucumbers, obviously, but also green beans, beets, peppers, onions, asparagus, garlic, carrots, cauliflower, and virtually any dense vegetable you can grow or harvest. Number 9. Fermentation. Letting life preserve life. We are almost at the halfway point of this list, and I want to pause here for a moment because fermentation is not just another technique. Fermentation is a worldview. It is the understanding that life, carefully cultivated and given the right conditions, can be harnessed to protect other life. That beneficial microorganisms, given a slight environmental advantage, will outcompete and crowd out everything that would harm your food. It is preservation through ecology rather than through chemistry, and it may be the single most profound food technology human beings ever discovered. Every traditional food culture on Earth developed fermentation independently, not because they were in communication with each other, because wherever humans and fresh food existed together in the same space, the conditions for fermentation were present, and the results were obvious enough that observant, practical people could not fail to notice and replicate them. Sauerkraut in Germany and across Central Europe, kimchi in Korea, injera in Ethiopia, kvass in Russia, miso and natto in Japan, tempeh in Indonesia, yogurt and kefir across Central Asia, kvass, poke, chicha across the Americas. These are not cultural accidents or coincidences. They are the universal human discovery that a small amount of salt, a controlled temperature, and enough time transforms perishable seasonal food into something that lasts through winter and actively supports the health of everyone who eats it. Lacto-fermentation is the most accessible form, and it is the foundation of most traditional vegetable ferments. Lactobacillus bacteria live naturally on the surface of all fresh vegetables. They are present right now on every head of cabbage, every carrot, every cucumber, every pepper in your garden or on your counter. Given an environment with enough salt to suppress competing organisms and enough time to establish themselves, these bacteria consume the sugars present in the vegetable and produce lactic acid as a byproduct. That lactic acid drops the pH of the fermentation environment rapidly and reliably, creating conditions in which harmful bacteria cannot survive or reproduce. The process is largely self-regulating. Once lactic acid bacteria establish dominance, they maintain it. The method for basic lacto-fermented vegetables is almost insultingly simple Once you understand the principle, shred or chop your vegetable finely. Weigh it. Add non-iodized salt at approximately 2% of the vegetable's weight, which works out to roughly 1 teaspoon per pound. Massage the salt into the vegetable for several minutes until it releases significant amounts of liquid. Pack the salted vegetable tightly into a clean glass jar, pressing down firmly so that the vegetable's own liquid rises to cover the surface completely. That liquid brine is your preservation medium, and the lactobacillus are already living in it. Keep the jar at room temperature, between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, out of direct sunlight for 3 to 7 days. Taste it daily. When it has reached a level of sour, complex, alive flavor that you find satisfying, move it to cold storage where fermentation will slow dramatically and the product will keep for months. That is sauerkraut. That is the foundation of fermented pickles. That is a technique that billions of human beings use to carry the nutrients of summer harvest through the nutritional desert of winter. It costs almost nothing. It requires almost no equipment. And the health benefits of consuming traditional lacto-fermented vegetables, the probiotic diversity, the improved bioavailability of nutrients, the protective effects on gut health, are among the most well-documented in modern nutritional science. Number 10. Garlic oil infusion. Flavor, medicine, and preservation in one jar. Garlic is one of those ingredients that sits at the intersection of food, medicine, and preservation in a way that virtually no other single ingredient does. Its sulfur compounds, particularly allicin and its derivative compounds, are responsible not only for garlic's powerful, distinctive flavor, but for documented antimicrobial properties that have been recognized in traditional healing systems across cultures for thousands of years. Infusing those compounds into oil creates a preparation that carries both the flavor and some of the functional character of the garlic into a medium that is extraordinarily versatile in the kitchen. Traditional preparation involved peeling fresh garlic cloves, sometimes lightly crushing them to increase surface area and accelerate the infusion process, and submerging them in quality olive oil in a sealed container. The garlic slowly releases its aromatic and functional compounds in the oil over the course of several days, producing infused oil that is useful as a cooking medium, a condiment, a flavor base, and a short-term preserved ingredient. I need to repeat the safety note from oil submersion here, because this is genuinely important. Fresh garlic and oil at room temperature creates a low-oxygen environment that can support the growth of Clostridium botulinum. This preparation must be stored in the refrigerator and used within 1 to 2 weeks. It is a short-term preservation and culinary enhancement technique, not a shelf-stable long-term product. Traditional users understood this because they made small batches and consumed them quickly within their natural use pattern. The danger arises when people try to scale up or extend the shelf life beyond what the technique actually supports. Within those parameters, garlic oil infusion is one of the most useful preparations in any kitchen that takes ingredients and flavor seriously. It transforms a humble clove of garlic into a ready-to-use flavor base that elevates everything it touches. This multi-purpose, waste-nothing approach to a single ingredient is exactly the kind of thinking that defined ancestral food culture at its best. Number 11. Fat sealing. Confit, the French farmhouse miracle. The word confit comes from the French verb confire, meaning to preserve, and that etymology tells you everything you need to know about the original purpose of this technique. Before it became a marker of fine dining, before duck confit appeared on restaurant menus as a luxury item, confit was a farmhouse survival strategy in the Gascony region of southwest France, and it was practiced by people who needed to extend the life of their autumn butchering through the lean months of winter with nothing more than a heavy pot, some animal fat, low heat, and a cool cellar. The preservation mechanism is identical to oil submersion. Cooked meat submerged completely in its own rendered fat is sealed away from all contact with oxygen, and aerobic bacteria cannot establish themselves in an oxygen-free environment. But confit adds a critical additional layer that oil submersion of raw food doesn't provide. The slow, low-temperature cooking process, traditionally carried out at temperatures between 180 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours, kills pathogens within the meat itself before it ever goes into the fat seal. The combination of internal pathogen elimination through heat and external environmental exclusion through the fat seal produces a preservation result that neither technique achieves on its own. Duck legs, pork shoulder, goose thighs, rabbit pieces, all of these were traditionally prepared this way and stored in earthenware crocks completely submerged in their rendered fat in the cool cellar, where they could last for months. The practical home setup requires no specialty equipment. A heavy pot or Dutch oven, enough rendered fat to submerge your meat completely, low heat maintained over several hours, and a cool storage location. The fat can be reused multiple times, and each successive batch of confit absorbs the flavors of everything that came before, developing a depth and complexity that no industrial process can replicate. Garlic confit deserves special mention as possibly the single most useful prepared ingredient you can keep in your kitchen. Whole garlic cloves slowly cooked in olive oil at low temperature until soft, golden, and caramelized, then stored submerged in that oil in the refrigerator. It keeps for weeks. It takes 5 minutes of active preparation, and it transforms the flavor of everything from pasta to roasted vegetables to a simple piece of bread into something that feels deeply considered and intentional. Number 12. Brining, the liquid salt bath that does everything. Brining is salt curing's more flexible and arguably more versatile sibling, and it may be the single most widely applicable preservation technique on this entire list. Where dry salt curing draws moisture out of food through direct physical contact, brining works differently. It creates a saline solution so inhospitable to harmful bacteria that they cannot establish populations within it, while simultaneously allowing the brine to penetrate deeply into food's cellular structure, fundamentally changing its texture, moisture retention, and flavor in ways that modern food science is still working to fully explain. A basic brine is salt dissolved in water, typically between 2 and 10% salt by weight depending on the application. At 2 to 4%, you have a light brine appropriate for short-term flavor enhancement and minor preservation benefit. At 6 to 8%, you have a preservation brine capable of meaningfully extending shelf life. At 10% and above, you have a curing brine for long-term preservation of proteins. These distinctions were understood intuitively by every traditional food culture that relied on brining, even if they didn't articulate them in those terms. Traditional brining applications were vast. Fish were brined before smoking or drying, combining two preservation techniques into a single protocol. Meats were brined before roasting or extended storage. Olives, which are completely inedible in their raw state due to the bitter compound oleuropein, are transformed by weeks or months of brine curing into the olives that appear in virtually every Mediterranean food tradition. Capers, anchovies, preserved lemons, traditional butter, cornichons. Every one of these traditional preserved foods involves brining at some stage of production. The practical home application is immediately accessible. For flavor improvement and short-term preservation of poultry or pork, soak the protein in a 4 to 6% brine in the refrigerator for several hours to overnight before cooking. The salt penetrates the muscle fiber, seasons the meat throughout rather than just on the surface, and significantly improves moisture retention during cooking. For longer-term vegetable preservation, a stronger brine poured over packed vegetables in clean jars and stored in cool conditions will preserve them for weeks to months. This is the method behind traditional Appalachian stack pickles, Northern European vegetable preservation, and dozens of regional traditions across Asia and the Middle East. Number 13. Fruit leather drying. Ancestral nutrition. You can roll up. Fruit leather sounds like it belongs in a modern health food store next to the protein powders and the adaptogen blends. It does not. It belongs to a preservation tradition that stretches back thousands of years across indigenous cultures in North America, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where people understood intuitively that concentrating the nutritional content of ripe seasonal fruit through controlled drying produced something extraordinary. A lightweight, shelf-stable, extraordinarily nutrient-dense food that could sustain travelers, hunters, and working people through long journeys or difficult seasons. The technique is exactly as it sounds. Ripe fruit, and the riper the better because higher sugar content both enhances flavor and contributes to preservation, is pureed into a smooth, even consistency and spread in a thin, uniform layer onto a drying surface. In traditional practice, this was wooden boards, flat rocks, or woven mats. The thin layer dries over 1 to 3 days in the sun or in a warm, dry environment with good air circulation, concentrating the fruit's natural sugars and acids as moisture evaporates. The resulting sheet has a moisture content typically below 20%, which prevents the growth of mold and bacteria, while the concentrated natural sugars create an additional osmotic environment hostile to microbial activity. Properly made fruit leather stored in a cool, dry location in airtight packaging can last 6 months to a year without refrigeration. Any fruit produces it. Apples, pears, peaches, plums, mangoes, berries individually or in combinations all work beautifully. A squeeze of lemon juice added to the puree before spreading boosts both flavor and shelf life by adding an additional acidic barrier. A drizzle of raw honey accomplishes the same thing while adding its own preservation chemistry. The nutritional concentration is remarkable. A single sheet of dried apple leather contains a nutritional content of several whole apples in a fraction of the weight and volume. This is why fruit leather was a standard trail and travel food for indigenous North Americans long before anyone coined the phrase energy bar. They had already solved that problem with nothing more than ripe fruit and sunshine. Number 14. Grain storage in airtight jars. The pantry that survives anything. This is simultaneously the simplest technique on this list, and arguably the most foundational for genuine long-term food security. Grains, rice, wheat berries, dried corn, rolled oats, dried beans, lentils, and split peas are already shelf-stable by their nature. They have evolved to be. Seeds are nature's long-term storage format, engineered by millions of years of selection pressure to survive precisely the conditions they'll face in the ground waiting to germinate. The enemies of stored grain are not time itself, but the specific conditions that accelerate deterioration. Moisture activates enzymatic processes and allows mold growth. Oxygen oxidizes fats in the grain and supports aerobic organisms. Temperature fluctuations stress the grain's cellular structure. And pests, insects, and rodents consume and contaminate what they reach. Every traditional grain-storing civilization developed systems for controlling these variables long before food science could explain the mechanisms. Ancient Egyptian grain stores were built with architectural features specifically designed to regulate interior temperature and humidity. Roman military granaries were engineered with specific ventilation principles. Pioneer homesteaders sealed grain in wooden barrels with tight-fitting lids and added bay leaves or diatomaceous earth as natural pest deterrents. The bay leaves work through the same volatile aromatic compounds that make them useful in cooking. Those compounds are genuinely repellent to grain beetles and weevils. This is not folklore. It is pest management through plant chemistry. The modern adaptation requires almost no investment. Wide-mouth glass mason jars with tight sealing lids are ideal storage vessels. Glass is completely impermeable to moisture, oxygen, and pests. It doesn't off-gas chemical compounds the way some plastics do. It's inert, infinitely reusable, and cheap. Fill jars to the neck, minimizing the airspace inside. For storage of 1 year or more, add an oxygen absorber, which you can purchase inexpensively, or use a dry ice displacement method to eliminate the residual oxygen in the headspace before sealing. Add a dry bay leaf or two to each jar. Store in a location that is cool, consistently dark, and dry, because temperature stability matters more than absolute coolness. Fluctuating temperatures are more damaging than a consistently moderate temperature. Properly stored white rice or dried beans sealed in glass jars at stable room temperature can remain nutritionally viable for 25 years or more. This is not homesteading mythology. It is documented food science. Number 15. Ice preservation. The old school harvest. Before electric refrigerators existed, before mechanical refrigeration of any kind, there were ice houses. And in 19th century America, the ice trade was one of the most economically significant industries in the country. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King of Boston, built a fortune and an empire on the simple principle of harvesting naturally formed ice from frozen ponds and rivers in winter, packing it in sawdust or insulation, and shipping it to customers who needed it to preserve their food. Ice was shipped from New England to the Caribbean, to India, to London, because the demand for cold food preservation was so powerful and so universal that people would pay for ice to travel thousands of miles across oceans. But long before commercialized delivery, long before the ice trade, people were harvesting and storing natural ice in ways that were remarkably effective. Traditional ice houses were built partially or fully below grade, taking advantage of the Earth's natural thermal stability. Ice harvested in winter was packed in dense layers with sawdust between them for insulation and could last well into summer in a properly constructed ice house. Food stored in the cold zones of the ice house remained fresh for days or weeks, dramatically extending its usable life past what ambient temperature would allow. The underlying principle is simply that cold temperatures slow enzymatic activity and microbial reproduction, both of which are primary mechanisms of food spoilage. Slow them enough through cold, and you extend food's usable life proportionally. Insulation slows the loss of cold from whatever cold storage you have, whether that a block of ice, a cold cellar, or a stream-fed cold box built over a natural spring. These were all traditional solutions to the problem of maintaining cold without electricity, and they work reliably for the generations that use them. Understanding these principles gives you real options when the grid fails, which history tells us it will. And when it does, the people who know how to keep food cold without electricity will be in a dramatically better position than those who don't. Number 16. Wax coating, cheese preservation, and the seal that keeps cheese alive. Cheese waxing sits right at the intersection of traditional craft and practical food science, and it represents one of the more sophisticated traditional preservation techniques in terms of the nuance required to do it well. The fundamental challenge of aging hard cheese outside a purpose-built cave or carefully controlled environment is that the cheese needs protection from rapid moisture loss and from invasion by unwanted mold species, while simultaneously being allowed to continue developing its internal character through ongoing biochemical processes. Cheese wax addresses this challenge elegantly. Applied correctly to the exterior of a properly prepared cheese, it creates a flexible, airtight seal that dramatically slows moisture loss and blocks environmental contaminants, while allowing the interior of the cheese to mature undisturbed over months. The tradition of wax-coating cheese developed specifically in the Dutch cheese trade of the late medieval period. Edam and Gouda, the iconic Dutch cheeses, developed their characteristic wax coatings as a practical solution to the problem of shipping cheese across long distances and extended time periods without it spoiling before it reached its buyers. Wheels of wax-coated cheese survived months-long sea voyages and arrived at markets across Europe, and eventually the world in sellable condition. Cheese was a critical protein source for sailors, traders, and explorers in an era before refrigeration, and wax made it possible to carry that protein source across distances that would otherwise have been impossible. For home cheese makers, wax coating is a technique that makes extended aging accessible without specialized equipment. Allow your pressed cheese to form a natural rind over 3 to 5 days of surface, drying in a cool, ventilated location. Use food-grade cheese wax, not paraffin, which is too brittle and cracks as the cheese expands and contracts with temperature changes. Melt the wax and dip the cheese wheel or apply it in multiple brush layers, rotating to ensure complete and even coverage with no gaps. Store the wax wheel in a cool, consistently ventilated location, a root cellar or cool basement, and allow it to age. Properly waxed hard cheeses can mature at cellar temperatures for 6 months to a year or more. Number 17. Water glassing eggs. A year's worth of eggs in a crock. And here it is, the one I promised you at the beginning of this video, and it genuinely delivers on everything that promise suggested. Water glassing is an egg preservation technique so effective that it sounds impossible until you understand the chemistry, and even then it feels like something from a different world than the one we currently live in. Eggs stored in a lime water solution remain fully edible, nutritious, and usable for 9 to 18 months without refrigeration, not technically preserved in a way that requires substantial adjustment. Actually edible, cookable, and nutritious, available to you 12 to 18 months after they were laid. The chemistry is straightforward once you have the vocabulary for it. Calcium hydroxide, sold commercially as pickling lime or hydrated lime, is a strongly alkaline compound. When dissolved in water, it creates a solution with a pH around 12. That alkaline solution interacts with the surface of the eggshell in a specific and remarkable way. Eggshells are porous. They have thousands of microscopic pores through which gas exchange and moisture loss occur gradually over time. These pores are what allow a fresh egg to slowly lose quality, even under refrigeration. The lime solution seals those pores with calcium carbonate deposits, essentially mineralizing the shell's surface and freezing the egg's internal condition at the moment of submersion. Traditional American farm families used water glassing as a standard seasonal practice in the decades before electric refrigeration became universally available. Hens produce abundantly through spring and summer when days are long. Vegetation is available, and the biological imperative to reproduce is at its peak. They slow or stop laying entirely through the short, dark days of winter. Water glassing allowed farm families to preserve the abundance of the productive season and draw on it through the months when fresh eggs were scarce or unavailable. It was not a survival extreme. It was a normal, practical, expected part of managing a farm household's food supply. The method requires almost nothing. Mix 1 ounce of pickling lime per quart of clean water in a food-safe container, a ceramic crock, a food-grade bucket, or a large glass jar. Stir until the lime is dissolved. The solution will appear milky. Gently lower clean, fresh, unwashed eggs into solution. This is critical. The eggs must not have been washed. Fresh eggs straight from the nest have a natural coating called a bloom or cuticle, a protein layer applied by the hen during laying that provides the egg's first line of defense against bacterial penetration. Commercial eggs in the United States are legally required to be washed, which removes the bloom and makes them unsuitable for water glassing. You need fresh, unwashed eggs from your own hens or from a local producer who doesn't wash them. Submerge the eggs completely in the lime solution and cover the container to prevent evaporation and contamination. Store in a cool, dark location. The eggs will sink naturally. When you need an egg, reach in, retrieve it, rinse it thoroughly under clean water, and use it exactly as you would a fresh egg. At 9 to 12 months, you may notice that the yolk doesn't stand quite as tall when fried, and the white may be slightly thinner, but the egg is fully safe, fully nutritious, and entirely functional for any cooking application. Number 18. Smoking. Fire, flavor, and a barrier nothing can cross. Smoking is a preservation technique responsible for the smoked salmon traditions of the Pacific Northwest, the ham houses of Virginia and North Carolina, the cured meat cultures of Germany and Scandinavia, the smoked herring traditions of Scotland and the Netherlands, and the smoked fish industries of virtually every coastal culture that has ever existed anywhere on Earth. It is one of the most ancient, most complex, and most culturally significant food technologies in human history. And what it does at a chemical level is one of the most sophisticated transformations in all of culinary tradition. Smoke preserves through multiple simultaneous mechanisms, which is why it has been so consistently effective across such a wide range of climates, food types, and cultural contexts. The heat of smoking, even at relatively low temperatures, dries the exterior surface of food, reducing surface moisture and creating a physical barrier to bacterial entry. The smoke itself deposits a complex mixture of phenolic compounds, aldehydes, and organic acids onto the food surface. These compounds are not just flavors. They are genuine antimicrobial agents that inhibit bacterial growth on the surface of the meat or fish. And the salt that is almost universally applied before smoking adds its own osmotic preservation effect, working synergistically with the heat and the smoke to create a preservation system whose combined effect is substantially greater than any of its individual components. Traditional cold smoking, performed at temperatures between 70 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit over many hours or even days, is primarily a preservation technique. The smoke penetrates deeply into the food. The drying is thorough and slow, and the result is something that can be stored at room temperature for weeks or months. Cold smoked salmon, cold smoked pork belly, cold smoked sausages. These are preservation products that happen to taste extraordinary. Hot smoking, performed at temperatures above 165 degrees Fahrenheit, is primarily a cooking technique with secondary preservation benefits, and the result is food that is fully cooked and extended in shelf life, but not preserved in the same deep sense as properly cold smoked product. Wood species matter enormously in smoking, and traditional smokers knew the wood choices as intimately as they knew their animals and their farms. Hickory produces the deep, assertive, slightly aggressive smoke that defines the American barbecue tradition. Alder is a traditional wood for Pacific salmon, because its mild, slightly sweet smoke complements rather than overwhelms a delicate fish. Apple and cherry would produce light, sweet, fruity smoke well suited to pork and poultry. Mesquite burns extremely hot and produces intense smoke that can easily overpower food if used carelessly. Oak is a universal baseline, a reliable, moderate smoke appropriate for almost any application. Number 19. Leaf wrapping, the biodegradable food packaging that actually works. Leaf wrapping is simultaneously the most ancient and the most urgently relevant technique on this list. Ancient because it predates every other form of food packaging by thousands of years. Urgently relevant because the modern food packaging industry, having spent decades designing and manufacturing elaborate systems of plastic film, foam trays, vacuum sealing, and modified atmosphere packaging, still cannot fully replicate what specific plant leaves accomplish naturally for free with zero waste and no environmental cost. Certain plant leaves contain antimicrobial compounds in their cellular structure and on their surfaces. They have waxy cuticles that regulate moisture in both directions, preventing the food wrap inside from drying out while simultaneously preventing the accumulation of excess surface moisture that would encourage mold. They provide physical protection from contamination, and in many cases, they contribute flavor compounds that enhance the food they're wrapping, making the packaging itself an ingredient rather than a disposable material to be thrown away. Banana leaves are used throughout Southeast Asia, Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Pacific Islands because they are large, flexible, heat-resistant, and contain natural antimicrobial compounds that extend the life of whatever they wrap. Corn husks used in tamale traditions across Mesoamerica provide a semi-permeable wrapper that manages steam and moisture during cooking and then continues to slow spoilage afterward. Fig leaves contain specific enzymes and antimicrobial compounds that European traditions use for wrapping fresh and aged cheeses, both preserving them and contributing to their flavor development. Lotus leaves in Chinese and Vietnamese cooking traditions impart a distinctive floral quality to rice dishes wrapped and steamed within them. Grape leaves, still alive in the dolma traditions of Greek, Turkish, Armenian, and Middle Eastern cuisines, provide both flavor and a light preservation effect to the grain and herb preparation stuff inside them. The practical takeaway for home use extends beyond tropical leaves. In any climate where large, intact leaves are available, fig leaves, grape leaves from a backyard vine, large chard or kale leaves, lotus leaves from a pond, Leaf wrapping provides short-term preservation and meaningful flavor enhancement for food stored or cooked within them. The leaves cost nothing. They produce no waste. They perform the functions they are asked to perform, and then they return to the earth. This is the one technique on this list where the traditional solution is not just adequate compared to the modern alternative. It is genuinely better. Number 20, clay pot sealing, the technology that never needed improving. And here we are at the end of the list. The one I promised you at the start was so ancient it predates written history entirely. And I want you to understand what that means before we get into mechanics. Clay pot preservation technology does not merely predate the modern food industry. It does not merely predate the Industrial Revolution. It predates writing. It predates agriculture in some forms. It predates everything we conventionally think of as human civilization. And it works through principles so perfectly suited to the task of food preservation that 10,000 years of subsequent technological development have produced nothing that surpasses it for its specific applications. Unglazed clay is a slightly porous material. That porosity, which sounds like a flaw in a storage vessel, is precisely what makes it effective. Clay breathes. Moisture can migrate slowly through its walls in both directions. When the exterior surface of a clay pot is exposed to dry air, moisture slowly evaporates from the surface, and that evaporation draws a small amount of heat out of the pot's interior through the thermodynamic process of evaporative cooling. A clay pot sitting in shade in a dry climate can maintain its interior temperature 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit below the ambient air temperature outside it, with no energy input, no moving parts, no maintenance, no power supply. This is the original refrigerator, and it was operating in North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia thousands of years before anyone attempted to mechanize cold storage. Clay also has high thermal mass, meaning it absorbs and releases heat slowly. Rather than heating up quickly when ambient temperature rises and cooling down quickly when it falls, clay buffers its contents against temperature fluctuations, maintaining a more stable interior environment than the surrounding air. For food storage, stability matters almost as much as absolute temperature. When sealed will live the same unglazed clay, packed with beeswax, tallow, or a clay slip mixed with paste, a clay pot creates a storage environment that is stable in temperature, regulated in humidity, and sealed against outside contamination. Grain, oil, wine, honey, preserved meats, and dried foods were stored in clay vessels by virtually every civilization that has ever built one. Archaeological sites on every inhabited continent contain clay storage vessels as one of the most universal artifacts of human civilization. They are universal precisely because the principles underlying their effectiveness are universal. Clay is available almost everywhere. Evaporative cooling works everywhere. That air is drier than the pot's interior. High thermal mass is a property of clay regardless of where on earth it was formed. The modern revival of clay pot use among serious gardeners, food preservers, and homesteaders is not nostalgia. It is recognition that for specific applications, particularly root vegetable storage and grain preservation, where natural humidity regulation genuinely matters, unglazed clay outperforms glass, plastic, and metal because it actively manages the interior environment rather than simply enclosing it. 20 techniques. 20 ways to step off the conveyor belt of industrial food dependency. None of them require electricity. None of them require a subscription, a corporation supply chain, a manufacturer's warranty, or a credit card. They require knowledge, skill, and the decision to stop outsourcing your food security to systems that don't care whether you eat. Think about what you've learned in this video today. Salt curing, air drying, sun drying, oil submersion, honey preservation, root cellaring, herb ash coating, vinegar pickling, fermentation, garlic oil infusion, confit, brining, fruit leather, grain storage, ice preservation, wax coating, water glassing, smoking, leaf wrapping, clay pot sealing. Not one of these techniques was invented in a laboratory. Every single one of them was developed by ordinary people, farmers and fishermen and homesteaders and traveling merchants, people who needed to feed their families through conditions that made convenience impossible, and who developed these methods through generations of careful, practical, empirical work. Our great-grandparents knew most of this as kitchen knowledge, children's knowledge, the kind of thing you absorb by standing next to your parents in the root cellar, watching the eggs go down into the lime crock, smelling the wood smoke from the smokehouse drifting across the farm in October. We didn't lose this knowledge by accident. We were sold convenience as a replacement for it. And most of the time, convenience works fine, right up until it doesn't, until the power goes out for a week, until the supply chain breaks, until the store shelves go empty. when those moments come, and history tells us clearly that they always do. The people who know how to preserve food are the people who eat. That knowledge is what Recreational Roots exists to protect and to share. If you learned something today that changed how you think about your food supply and your family's resilience, please smash that like button. It helps this video reach the people who need this information most. Drop a comment below and tell me which technique you're starting with. Are you going straight to water glassing? Are you building a root cellar? Are you firing up the smoker? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know. And if you are not yet subscribed to Recreational Roots, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This knowledge belongs to all of us. Let's make sure it doesn't get lost again. You said, write a ready-to-publish YouTube description for the channel, using only the channel name, title, and keyword tiers I supply, or, if any are missing, derive them